Hey everyone, welcome. My name is Anthony Fiore. I'm a Senior Partner Solutions Architect at Amazon Web Services, and I'm going to be giving you an introduction into Amazon S3 today. So I will be a couple of things just for housekeeping items. This is being recorded, and it's going to be tough to do like an interactive session, but please do throw questions in chat, questions, comments, all that, and I'll be happy to take those questions as we go along. So we've got a packed agenda, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So okay, so before we get too far into S3, I kind of want to take a step back and talk about some of the difference between block, file, and object, right? So there's generally three different storage types, right? We've got our block storage. So we think of that as raw storage. It's generally presented to a host or a virtual machine through, say, SAN. It might be direct attach, right? You might be doing some sort of like a fiber attach. You might be with a storage area network, might be doing a SCSI or a SAS or any sort of storage arrays. This is, you think of it in a simple way, block storage is basically what you would see when on a Windows host where you have a C drive and a D drive. Most of that underlying storage is going to be block storage. So and that is where it's basically your operating system is writing directly to the storage without any, it's generally the most efficient path, especially when performance is key and you require the least latency possible. Block storage is generally the way to go. So you'll see things like databases and whatnot running on block storage, high performance computing and whatnot. Then we look into the next class of storage, which is file storage. So this is where we start getting into what we call unstructured data. And instead of presenting block storage like an unformatted partition as we would in block, right? File storage is being presented. It's already formatted. Generally, there's generally a structure to the file system, right? So it's presented as a file system. So you think of things like Windows file shares, network attached storage, like a NetApp array, or something like an Isilon array. These are generally what we would consider file storage. So the advantages to file storage is for things like home directories and whatnot, where you need to share these file systems among multiple different clients, right? A client could be a server, a client could be your computer, right? It could be your workstation, your desktop, your laptop. You log in and you have your home directory there. That's generally where we see file storage. And then last we have object storage. So object storage is pretty, for those like me, I've been in the IT industry for over 20 years, and I typically didn't see a lot of object storage. I was more on the infrastructure operations side. I saw mostly block, some file, but object we really didn't see very much. But now in the cloud with AWS, object storage is something I talk about pretty much every day, especially specific to S3. And the concepts are very different compared to block storage. For one, you're generally using APIs to access this data. Even if you're going through the AWS console to say access S3, still making use of APIs. You're not making, whereas with block storage, you're doing, say, a copy, or you would be doing a direct write there. Everything with object storage is generally API driven. There's also a lot of metadata to keep in mind with object storage. There's a lot of policies. You can do things like tagging with object storage. And really what it's meant to be is, we think of object storage, it is exactly that. It's storing objects, right? So we don't store files in object storage. We store objects in object storage, and it's easy to kind of sometimes it's a matter of habit to say, hey, I've got this file in an S3 bucket because it looks like a file, and that's what we're used to. And but it's really just it's really just a blob of data, and there's no such thing as directories. It's really just a virtual container in object storage. So an example of that would be S3, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Lastly, when we talk about things like storage, there's a lot of different trade-offs we have to consider. So I talked about block storage a little bit, and talked about things like with block storage, there's that's generally where we see some of the more higher performance applications using that, right? So we've got to think about, but that's just one measure here, right? There's a lot of different things to consider and a lot of different trade-offs when we're thinking about what kind of storage we're going to use for a particular use case, whether it be performance, are we indexing more on cost, security, durability, how are we, and generally where we want to start with the use cases, how are we going to access this, right? So if you've got an application that can only talk to that can only talk to, say, directory structure, then maybe file would be a better choice, right? If it can talk to object storage and it can use those native APIs, say the S3 API, then maybe object storage is better. So lots of real things to consider. And with Amazon Web Services, we have our storage offerings are pretty broad. We cover kind of everything from block storage to file storage to object storage. We also cover backup, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about things like how we get data into this object storage, right? So Amazon Web Services has a lot of different things here. So I'm not going to boil the ocean, but just kind of use this more as a kind of refresher. And I think a lot of us, some of us know this already. But now let's talk generally about Amazon S3. So Amazon S3 is 15 years young. We celebrated its 15th birthday and what we call Pi Day this year. March 14th, 2006 was when it was launched. It's one of our oldest services in the Amazon Web Services portfolio out of the 175 plus that we have now. Like I mentioned, it is a web accessible object store. You can interact with it through HTTPS, through APIs. And it is really durable, and we'll get into what durability means a little bit later. But another really nice function of Amazon S3 is how it's virtually limitlessly scalable. So you don't really have to worry about, okay, how big is this directory that I'm putting these files in, right? Since Amazon S3 is going to grow with you, right? You never have to worry about a quota or how big a directory is or how big a file share is. So you're essentially never going to run out of space when you're using Amazon S3. So it's a real great foundation for things like data lakes and things like backups. And we're going to get into some use cases later on in the presentation. There's also multiple tiers. By tiers, we also mean storage classes. We started off with one storage class, S3 Standard, back when it first launched, and we've kind of grown to multiple now. We'll talk more about some of the differences between those because some of them may be more applicable to a specific use case than others. And the way we utilize some of those different storage classes are things that are either doing direct puts into some of these storage classes or using what we call lifecycle policies. So where we can take a object, start it off in one storage class, and then after a certain period of time, age it down to different storage classes over the different lifecycle of that object, and in those lifecycle policies, we can also talk about when we may want to expire a particular object. The flip side to being limitlessly scalable is that since you pay for what you use with Amazon S3, you want to make sure that you're just not using it to just store things that are never going to be used again, right? So if you otherwise you're going to be paying for things that you don't use, right? So if it's an object, if it's in S3, you're going to be paying for it. We'll talk about pricing when we get into the storage classes, but that's where things like expiration policies can kind of come into effect. Another nice thing about Amazon S3 is since it can be used through HTTPS protocol, a lot of customers have used S3 to host static websites, right? So think of things that don't really change much, right? Graphics, pictures, right? I'll bet you most of the, when I look at a news article, for example, right, I look at some of these, some of where the images are hosted. Generally, you'll see a lot of links to images in a news article or something on the internet, like a blog post. It'll be hyperlinked. That image will actually be stored in S3. So it's really good for that because it's great and it's very great for things when you've got static. It's not supposed to take the place of, say, an Apache web server or anything like that. If you've got dynamic content, for example, right? But for those static things, those static items like pictures, and images and whatnot, and even video video and podcasts and whatnot. It's a really great design for that. Two other things I want to talk about really quickly is that it's got a lot of different levers we can use to tweak security. We can make it as secure as we want to, depending on the use case, right? We've got a lot of our customers are in highly regulated environments like healthcare, financial services, making use of S3, and we keep adding to the feature set of S3 to allow customers to use this, interact with it, and store in a secure and compliant manner. So last I talked about the pricing a bit, and we'll talk more about this later, but nice part about S3 is that it's fairly inexpensive, right? So you look at the S3 standard storage class pricing, just for the cost of storage, is just a little bit over 2 cents per gigabyte. So yes, that adds up at scale when we start talking about petabytes of storage, but you don't have to worry about purchasing an entire array anymore, right? You don't have to worry about making that capital expenditure to buy a multi-terabyte array and figure out where you're going to put it in your data center, or if you even need a data center at all. Now it's just, okay, I need my object storage, I need it cheap, let's go. So let's talk a little bit about some of the infrastructure behind S3, right? So we got to start at the top. We'll start really high level here, right? So many of us know about our global infrastructure, and I'm just going to do a quick refresher here. So we currently have 25 geographical regions throughout the globe. We've got 6 in the works, and each one of these regions now has a minimum of at least 3 availability zones. Beijing was the only one that was the lone holdout, but I think it was last week we added that 3rd availability zone to Beijing. So now we've got every active region out there having at least 3 availability zones, and we're gonna get into more into why that matters in a little bit, especially in the context of S3. But within these regions, we have these availability zones, and availability zones are nothing more than 1 or more discrete data centers, and think of them on different fault domains, right? So they have their own different power supplies, own network connectivity. They're on different power grids from one another, right? But they're still interconnected with high-speed data links and high-speed networking between them. So in the event of an issue or an event with one availability zone, we actually procure additional network bandwidth in between AZs. So if 1 out of 3 AZs was to have an issue, traffic can be rerouted to one of the other AZs that is not having an issue, and we'd be able to do that without skipping a beat because we've over-provisioned capacity between our AZs from a network topology perspective. So a lot's really gone into how we design these availability zones. So if you think about traditionally, from a data center, again, most of my background is in infrastructure and operations. It's not cheap to build a data center, to maintain a data center, and operate a data center, right? So we're kind of doing all that undifferentiated heavy lifting, as we call it in Amazon Web Services. We're doing it on behalf of the customer. So we're running the data centers. We're worried about the build outs and how the power, cooling, and network topology is all done there. So, and that's really nice. So because you don't have to worry about any of this anymore, right? So what does this mean? So what does this matter to S3? So this is where we start talking about durability, right? So with S3, there's 11 nines of durability, right? So that's 99 point, lots of nines behind it. So what does that mean? So if we take a look at, what 4 nines of durability would be, that would be 2 copies of the same file or object on one site. So if I took a copy of my Etsy host file and copied it to another physical system, or have a copy of it on tape, that's 99. That's 4 nines of durability. Now, if we now have a copy of that file on 2 different sites, on 2 physically separate sites, now we're going to add another 9 to the durability, and then we're going to have 5 nines. Whereas with Amazon S3, we're basically most of our storage classes will have copies of a single object in 3 or more availability zones. And that's how we get those 11 nines of durability. So what that means is, in the event of an issue, or an event with one of those availability zones, whether it be something temporal or something, heaven forbid, some sort of a natural disaster or something like that with a single availability zone, your data is, you're still going to get access to your data, and you're still going to be able to read, write, and transact with S3 as if nothing ever happened, right? And that's really powerful, and especially in today's very data-driven age, speed matters and availability matters, right? And in 21st century digital-enabled businesses, they can't skip a beat. So this is a really, really powerful thing, and this really helps open up a lot of use cases where trust is evident. So let's take a look at some of the different storage classes. So many of the storage classes on this slide have a minimum of 3 availability zones. So in some regions where we have more than 3 availability zones, we may try, we're not guaranteeing, but there may be times when we even look to go beyond 3 availability zones. But at minimum, we're going to try and get to, we're going to have at least 3 availability zones for this data across most of these storage classes. I'll talk about the ones that don't first. So we've got one storage class called S3 one zone and frequent access, and that's different in that it only keeps your objects in a single availability zone. We do not tell you which availability zone it is in, but it is basically sitting in a single availability zone. Now, why would someone want to do that? Well, first reason is cost, right? One zone IA is a great use case for customers when this would be, say, a tertiary copy of the data. Maybe they already have it stored in their primary data center. Maybe they have it stored in the secondary data center, but they want to keep another copy in AWS, in S3, but they don't need it. They don't need it replicated across 3 availability zones. So that's where one zone IA is going to be helpful, because they're going to end up paying less for that, because there's less infrastructure involved, right? They're only in a single availability zone. So that's our one zone and frequent access. And the other one that's kind of an edge case is S3 for Outposts. So AWS Outposts is something that was announced during reInvent 2019, and something that's been popular with customers who want to be able to run native AWS services in their data center. So rather than going to an AWS region, they can run things like EC2, EBS, S3 in a rack in their own data center. So so S3 on Outposts is definitely something they can do, but that's a very different model, because the availability there is limited to that data center and that rack, and that's for customers who require they either have data locality requirements or latency requirements where they can't traverse the WAN to go over to transact with native AWS services. So now I'll spend a remainder of the time on this slide talking about some of the other storage classes that do have that 3 availability zone redundancy. So S3 standard, like I said, that's kind of like our flagship storage class, in my opinion, and that's where it's going to be able to provide data access within milliseconds, and that is by all means it's standard. And standard can sometimes sound boring, almost like a Honda Accord, right? But it's going to be reliable, and it's going to be predictable, and it's still going to be low cost. But then there's other storage classes that we can talk about where maybe you don't need, you're not going to be accessing these. You're going to have objects reside in S3, but you're not always going to access them very often, or it may be for archival or compliance purposes that you just keep them out there anyway. And that's when you want to start looking at things like S3 standard and frequent access. So in frequent access is going to give you a lower cost of storage than S3. But it's going to start adding things like retrieval fees per gigabyte. It's going to have a minimum object size of 128K, a minimum storage duration of about 30 days, meaning that if you delete a file, say if you delete an object 15 days into it after you just put it out there, we're still going to charge you for the 30 days. It's really meant for that longer term and frequent access access pattern there. So, but you're going to get it's going to be the cheaper cost of storage as a result. So as we start looking at scale, this becomes important, because there's a big difference between 2 cents per gigabyte with S3 standard versus half that, say, for S3 standard IA, right? But again, there's some different charges as a result of that. Now, as we look to some of those to the archive storage classes like S3 Glacier and Glacier Deep Archive, this is where you start seeing an even lower cost of storage than even infrequent access or OneZone. The kicker there is that you're going to need to actually retrieve the object first. So with standard, with S3 standard, with standard infrequent access, OneZone even, when you go to get an object, it's going to basically give you millisecond access to it. Whereas with Glacier and Glacier Deep Archive, it's going to say, if you try and get the object that's in Glacier or Glacier Deep Archive, it's going to say, it's going to come back with an error and say, I'm sorry, you need to retrieve me first. So it becomes an asynchronous operation where before you access an object in S3 Glacier or Glacier Deep Archive, you need to retrieve that object and then get it. And that could be on the order of minutes for expedited retrievals in Glacier, or up to 48 hours if you do bulk retrieval in Glacier Deep Archive. So this is where the cost of storage is lower, but you need to be able to be okay with, depending on the storage class and the retrieval times, you need to be okay with that. So you probably wouldn't want to have your business critical data that needs to be recovered in a matter of hours in Glacier Deep Archive, for example, right? Where we see the use cases for these storage classes is generally for what we call use cases where cheap and deep storage is required. And say audit and compliance purposes, where an auditor would come in and say, okay, restore XYZ for me from a year ago. You have a week to do it, just to make sure that you can do it as part of, say, a compliance audit or something like that. That's really where you're going to infrequently retrieve these, not so much for that business critical or mission critical type retrievals. And let's say you don't really know what your access patterns are, right? But you still want to be able to take advantage of the cost savings of some of these different tiers. That's why I left intelligent tiering off to last. So S3 intelligent tiering is a fairly newer storage class that we have, where basically you're going to pay a small management fee per object. And what that's going to do is, over time, it's going to start off that as objects go to intelligent tiering, it's going to look at the access patterns of those objects, and it's going to move those around between S3 standard, what we call the frequent tier, and the infrequent tier, which would be standard IA. And you'll be paying the cost of storage as a result of that. But you wouldn't have to worry about things like lifecycle costs, as if S3 intelligent tiering moves in between those two tiers. There's also now, we launched this during Storage Day last year in the fall of 2020, where we now have an archive tier option where you have to opt in for this. But for these objects that are truly, that they're much smaller, that they're not smaller, that are used much more infrequently, right? You can now take advantage of Glacier and Glacier Deep Archive storage classes, and intelligent tiering will take care of this for you in terms of moving it there. And again, the nice part is you're just paying a small monitoring fee, and this is really great for those objects where you just don't know what the access pattern is going to be, and very helpful there. So next, with S3, since we're talking object storage here and it's very API driven, there's a ton of different management features that we provide. We're going to get into some of these in more depth here, but some of the best practices we talk about is tagging, right? So being able to tag and organize a lot of these objects is very helpful at scale, right? Once you start getting into the millions, tens of millions of objects, that's where tagging really helps, as well as things like S3 prefixes. We're not going to get too much into S3 performance here, but that's where having a defined prefix strategy is very helpful. And then I'm not going to go through each one of these. I'm not going to read through each one of these, but there's a lot of different ways we provide customers to organize, to monitor, replicate, and tier. We talked about S3 intelligent tiering, and then even modify or not modify certain objects. So that should be quite helpful there. All right, so next I'm going to talk briefly about some of these access management and security items with S3. And because we say at AWS, security is always job zero here, right? And with the shared responsibility model, there's a lot of what we're responsible for, right? But with things like S3, since it is delivered as a service, there's also a lot of things. So AWS is going to take care of things like data center security and making sure that the storage, that the underlying physical infrastructure is secured properly, right? In terms of nobody having access to the hard drives that isn't authorized, right? But when it comes to actually encrypting the data itself, right, with your specific key, whether you want to encrypt it, whether you don't want to encrypt it, right? That's all that's all part of the shared responsibility model, and that's a customer. That's something that the customer would need to do. So this is where we start looking at some of the different options that we provide to customers based on how they need to secure and manage access to a lot of these. So we've got a very deep integration with our Identity and Access Management Service, IAM, as you may know. We have the ability to set bucket policies to allow for cross-account access and whatnot. We also have things like audit logs. We can be able to, we can tell who accessed objects if we needed to go back there by enabling object logging. We also support a number of different encryption options we'll get to later, but we've got the ability to do server-side encryption on objects, client-side encryption if needed at the SDK level. We can also do inventories to check the encryption status. We also have something that's been around for a while now in terms of block public access, and this could be done at the account level. So if you want to make sure that that there's no way for someone without proper authorization to access your bucket or from a public standpoint, right? Block public access is a really easy way to ensure that nothing, both at the bucket or the object level, would have public access. And that's something we recommend quite highly. Lastly, we've got Amazon Macie, and that's one of our more advanced security services that can help protect things like protect things like if there's any PII data that you want to classify and secure. Amazon Macie is a great service to kind of run on top of S3 for some of that personally identifiable information you want to make sure is secured, and get alerted if there's any sort of odd access patterns there. So with that, I'm going to go in a little bit into our IAM user and kind of the difference between what an IAM policy is and what a bucket policy is. So some of the differences here are, when we look at an IAM user policy, right? It's going to be IAM user policies. Generally, we like to talk about least privilege with IAM users, right? So we don't want to be creating IAM users and have everybody have administrative access, right? We generally want to give them access to the services that they need and as granular as possible, right? But the IAM user has the ability to control, IAM users have the ability to control any or all AWS services depending on what their policy is, right? Or a bucket policy is specific to that bucket itself. So IAM user, the other thing about IAM user policies is that by default, if you were to set up an IAM user and not provide any sort of policy, that user is going to have access to absolutely nothing. So by default, it's secure by default there, right? So whereas with bucket policies, if you don't have a bucket policy, it's not that it's going to be insecure by default, right? But it's not going to have, you're not going to be able to provide any granular controls without a bucket policy. So we look at this question like, who can access this S3 resource? Very helpful. This is where we can start doing things like saying, okay, only people coming from this account have access to the bucket. Only people from this site or block have access to the bucket. If you want to do cross-account bucket support, that's where this is helpful. And here's some JSON here in this next slide to talk about, and kind of to show some of the differences here, right? So if we look at the IAM user policy, it's basically allowing that IAM user to do a put object, which would be a write, or a get object, which would be a read to that specific bucket. In this example, my bucket. Or if we look at the bucket policy for my bucket, it's only allowing a certain AWS account to do get objects to my bucket, and even provides a condition to limit, to make sure, and saying, okay, it's going even further to say, well, you can only access this if it's got a specific tag, right? So you can get really, really granular. And if you make use of the two kind of interchangeably, you can have a really, really good strict security posture with this. So a lot of different things you can do here. I'm not going to get, I could probably spend an entire hour just talking about bucket policy in itself. I won't. But yeah, so to continue on, so let's talk about how you access S3, right? And some of the access patterns that we talk about with customers in accessing S3. So generally, you know, customers can access it through things like you can log into AWS console, you can access your S3 bucket, right? But generally, when we look at AWS services, things like EC2 instances, right, that need to access S3. S3 is what we would consider a public service, right? It is a public service, so meaning that you would need access to the internet in order to access S3 endpoints, right? It is a publicly facing endpoint. So if you're running an EC2 instance in a private subnet that does not have access to the internet, right? And you're either going to need to put a internet you're mostly going to want to put, say, a NAT gateway or a NAT instance in between your private subnet and the internet in order to be able to access S3. That's kind of before we had gateway endpoints, and there are still customers that do that today, but it's not something that we recommend. Number one, it's costly, right? Because if you look at our NAT gateway service, there is a charge per gigabyte, and at scale that could be very costly. And plus, it just adds another layer. It's something else to manage, which you don't have, and we're all about trying to invent and simplify here and reducing the amount of things you have to manage, like NAT gateways, if it's not necessary. So that's where a while ago, we had introduced this gateway endpoint. What a gateway endpoint basically is a think of it as kind of like a route that you would add in a route table. Once you have this gateway endpoint, and it's going to route your API calls to Amazon S3 from your private subnets to Amazon S3 without having to have internet access. So you can keep your private subnets private, not have to worry about the costs and additional overhead involved within that gateway, and still be able to access and transact with S3. And another nice feature about the gateway endpoints is that we talked about bucket policies. And this is something I've used in the past quite frequently, is you can say, okay, any puts, gets, deletes have to come from the ARN of a gateway VPC endpoint. So it's really nice in the events, you know, hopefully something doesn't happen like this, but let's say that the access key got into the wrong hands and somebody tried to access the S3 bucket, get objects, put objects, delete objects, right? If they're not coming from that VPC endpoint, it would deny them. So that's another nice feature of both VPC endpoints and bucket policies. Now, we took that a little bit further recently by introducing what we call private link for Amazon S3. So prior to private link happening, the only endpoint available for S3 was the gateway endpoint that I just talked about. And that was really meant for AWS services residing in a private subnet being able to access S3 without having to be open to the public, to the internet, so to speak, right? Whereas what we started hearing from customers is that since Amazon S3 is a public service, they wanted another way to be able to access S3 without going over either the public internet or going through a public VIF on a direct connection, right? They wanted to be able to have something in their VPC that they could route to, because a gateway endpoint is not a RFC compliance, it's not RFC compliant for routing purposes, right? Outside of a VPC, it's an Amazon resource. It's not going to have an IP address associated with it. So we introduced something called Private Link for S3. This is based on a lot of customer feedback, especially in regulated industries such as healthcare and financial services. And what this allows customers to do is, customers who need to have the ability to access S3 from on-premises, but want to go through, say, a VPN or through Direct Connect and not route that traffic over the public internet, they can now do that by creating an interface endpoint for S3 and that will connect to S3 over what we call private link. And an interface endpoint is nothing more than, think of it as a network load balancer, where it's going to basically, it's IP addresses, it's routable, it's going to sit inside your AWS subnets. So as long as you have the proper routes from on-premise to your subnets, you should be A-OK there. So one thing to keep in mind is that another difference between the gateway endpoint and the interface endpoint, gateway endpoint is absolutely free. There's no charge for using that. Whereas the interface endpoint, I talked about network load balancer, it's going to be, the charges are going to be kind of similar to a network load balancer. So depending on how many AZs you have the interface endpoint deployed in, there's going to be a charge for that, right? There'll be an hourly charge for that. In addition, there's also going to be a small amount of a small charge per gigabyte to as data passes through that interface endpoint. So this isn't something that you'd want to do by default, only if you really have a strict requirement for keeping all your data private over that interface endpoint when you're accessing it from things like on-prem. Let's talk about some other things like S3 replication. So even though objects in S3, like S3 standard, they have 11 nines of durability, some customers may want the ability to replicate that data, whether it be to buckets in the same region with what we call same region replication, or across regions with what we call cross region replication, or CRR. So customers can use that to replicate for additional availability. There are some customers that want to be able to have their they want to be able to have their data in a separate region for compliance purposes, for peace of mind purposes. Generally, it's a business requirement to do that. Remember, the unfortunate part is they're basically paying twice, right? They're going to pay for it to sit in region 1 and then do a cross-region replication, and they're going to pay for it to sit twice. So it's not, it's by no means free in order to do that. So that's something to keep in mind when you're thinking of, hey, should I do cross-region replication? Should I do same region replication? You want to make sure that there's a business driver behind that, because by default, S3 has the 11 nines of durability, and there may be other ways to solve for a problem. But we have that ability to replicate to same or cross region. And why would somebody want to replicate within the same region? A lot of times with data lakes, for example, right? When you have all your applications copy your objects into a single S3 bucket, right? You may want to keep that as a single source of truth, but you may have development work that needs to happen, and you don't want them accessing, say, that source of truth. So you do a same region replication to a bucket in the same region, and you give your development team or other teams or other business units access to those buckets. And if something happens, then it's only limited to that copy, to that replica, not that single source of truth there. So that's really nice. We also have something called replication time control for customers that are doing things like cross-region replication and have strict SLAs around it. So S3 replication time control is something that will be very helpful for them in that regard. There's a little extra charge for doing so, but otherwise there's really no hard and fast SLA for some of these replication items within this. So I also want to talk, so we'll talk more about S3 encryption, right? So encryption in transit, S3 supports, and S3 supports quite well. So we've got HTTPS and TLS, but then we've got a bunch of different options for encrypting objects at rest, right? We've got our default, which is what we consider SSE, server-side encryption S3. And this is really to protect against if someone were to, say, pull a hard drive out, ever had access to that physical infrastructure. Most often, this is a compliance requirement to keep things encrypted at rest. There's also the ability to do something called SSE KMS, where it's going to provide a little more granular access control, right? Than S3, SSE S3. So KMS, not only would you have to have access to the object, but you'd also need to have access to the KMS key in order to be able to decrypt to decrypt the file. Then there's SSEC, which would be customer provided keys, and lastly, there's client-side encryption, which is where you can basically use our AWS SDK to encrypt the file before it even leaves its source. I do want to talk a little bit about S3 Object Lock as well. So Object Lock is something that's it's relatively new, I guess, for S3, and it's a lot of customers are making use of Object Lock, especially now when we think about ransomware and bad actors, right? And what's nice about Object Lock is that once it's enabled on a bucket, it has to be enabled when you create the bucket, in addition to versioning. If for some reason you want to enable it on a bucket that's already existing, you can. You just need to file a ticket with AWS support. It's going to be a little tougher to do so, but it's possible. You don't have to start from scratch. But the nice part about Object Lock is it basically, once it's enabled and you set an Object Lock policy on the objects within that bucket, it's basically going to make them immutable. And we've got two different modes for Object Lock. We've got a governance mode and compliance mode. But this is being used quite extensively with customers now to store data in immutable format in S3. So if someone was storing backups in S3 and a ransomware event happened and it tried to basically delete the backups, assuming that the Object Lock was properly configured, it would basically deny that request to it would not allow that object to be deleted in S3. So a lot of folks use this for ransomware purposes, but also just for compliance purposes as well, right? Just to make sure that that data is immutable, it doesn't change. There's a lot of auditing built in here to track and report on some of these changes as well. So let's talk about some best practices we have. So we've got this is a really good place to start with Amazon S3 security. There's block public access, which we recommend enabling for default encryption using KMS, just because it provides that additional granularity around needing access to the key as well. Make sure you require TLS in your bucket policies. Enable VPC gateway endpoints. Those are the free ones, by the way. By default, put them in your route tables, and even go a step further, require those bucket policies where you limit access to certain VPC gateway endpoints. We've got versioning. Didn't really go into that much, but what versioning is that if someone overwrites a file, overwrites an object in S3, it's basically going to create a new version as a result of that. So if you needed to switch the version, somebody did an oops, that's where versioning is going to come into effect. Or even if they inadvertently delete the object, instead of actually deleting the object, S3 is going to put what we call a delete marker in its place. So the current version would be deleted, but the previous version would still be there and you still have access to that. If you need regional resiliency, we have cross-region replication. You can make use of Object Lock for permanence, as well as MFA delete, which will require you to put in the code from an MFA token before you delete anything. This is helpful for, say, audit log files and whatnot. But this is a great way to just kind of start, and this is a good way to have a very good security posture with S3 right off the bat. I want to talk a bit about, okay, how do we get data into S3, right, if we're not creating it within Amazon? So we'll talk about a couple of ways, and Storage Gateway is one of the easiest ways to do that. And we've got a number of different components within Storage Gateway, but I'm going to focus on two. First one is File Gateway, since this is a very popular option with customers. So what File Gateway is when you have an S3 bucket in your account, you would go ahead and create a File Gateway. The File Gateway is nothing more than a virtual appliance that would sit on premises. And what it's going to do is it's going to be able to present a SMB or an NFS share to your systems, say whether it be your servers, whether it be your clients. And what's happening is that as it writes, once those NFS shares are mounted from File Gateway, when you mount it and then you start writing data to that NFS share, what it's going to do behind the scenes, File Gateway is going to transparently upload that to S3. So this is great for applications where you'd want to be able to make use of storing a copy in S3, but you don't want to refactor the application to have to talk to object storage, right? So great use case for this is backups, right? So database backups, for example, database exports. You want to store it off-site. You don't want to worry about having to have these huge files sitting on backup storage, right? You can basically present this file gateway share, use this as a copy destination for your backup jobs, and then that will be transparently migrated to S3, or it will reside. So in case your on-premises systems has an issue and needs to recover back, it's going to have, they will be able to grab it from S3, either in native file format, or you could stand up another file gateway and attach it back to that S3 instance, and it'll be able to do that again. This is also a nice way if you want to say use home directories backed by S3 as well, right? Keep in mind with File Gateway, the biggest thing I've seen in my experience with File Gateway is, since it runs as a virtual machine, it's only going to run as good as the underlying hardware that you give it to it, right? So if you use it in a virtual environment where it's very oversubscribed to begin with, it's a very IO intensive sort of a thing where it's getting a lot of reads and writes, satisfying a lot of read and write requests from both on-premises from that SMB piece, but also doing a lot of reads and writes to S3. So you want to make sure that it's got enough horsepower to really keep up with some of the recommended workloads there. And another nice thing, where a nice drop-in replacement is what we call our tape gateway. And this is nothing more than another appliance that would be deployed on-prem, right? There's no charge for these appliances, by the way. The appliances themselves are free to deploy, whether it be tape gateway, whether it be file gateway. We don't charge by the appliance. We're charging S3 storage prices. There's a small charge up to $125 per month per gateway, for example, like with tape gateway. But it's pretty cost effective to run these. But basically what tape gateway is going to do is it's going to be able to plug right into your existing backup application and present itself as a virtual tape library. And instead of going to physical tapes, they're now going to go to virtual tapes. And those virtual tapes are actually, we're presenting it as virtual tapes, but behind the scenes, that's actually Amazon S3 when the virtual tape is checked into the tape library. But once it's checked out and out of the virtual tape library and on the virtual tape shelf, that's where it would be transitioned to, say, Glacier Deep Archive. So a really great way to make use of Amazon S3 storage in an existing application that may not have a native connector to S3. One thing to keep in mind here is the difference between tape gateway and file gateway is that all the data is stored in a service bucket in tape gateway. So what that means is that if you were using tape gateway and you wrote data to your tapes, to your virtual tapes, you're not going to be able to go into your S3 console and see the data in the tapes. Because that's stored in an S3 bucket that's owned by the tape gateway service. So it can only be transacted through tape gateway if you've got data on virtual tapes. Whereas file gateway, you're presenting a S3 bucket in your account, and there's no concept of a service bucket at that point. So you'd be able to get everything, be able to use everything both in file gateway and in AWS natively with an S3. Finally, I want to talk about two other options: Data Sync, which is a on-premise agent which can be used to quickly copy or migrate data from NFS shares to, as well as object storage, to things like Amazon S3. Very fast. It can actually saturate a WAN link pretty fast. It's a super fast protocol. Great for one-way transfers, right? Whereas File Gateway is better suited for, say, you want to be able to present an NFS share. This is more of, hey, I want to take files off my home directories and I want to put them all in S3, or I want to put them in something like an EFS file system. That's where Data Sync is going to help. Last but not least, Snowball Edge and Snowcone. So these are our Snowball Edge. It's about the size of a desktop PC. And what it is, it's something that you can order from the AWS console. It'll be sent to you. And it is a physical appliance where you would connect that up to your network. It's got SFP ports, for example, right? And you'll basically, what it's going to do is it's going to present itself as an S3 bucket. You would use the S3 adapter to copy your files onto the Snowball device. And this is used for import operations, right, where you'd see data into S3 using Snowball Edge, or Snowcone, which is a smaller device like Snowball Edge. And it's great if you want to be able to migrate large amounts of data at terabyte or even petabyte scales. and you just don't have the WAN bandwidth to do so, right? A lot of customers we see, they want to make use of S3, they want to migrate data in, but they've got terabytes of data, and they've got a small 25 or 50 meg link or 100 meg link that's pretty utilized, and it's going to take them weeks to do it all. Snowball Edge makes it a lot simpler because, if you think about the differences between going over using Snowball Edge or even multiple Snowball Edge devices to transfer 250 terabytes in this example, with 5 snowballs, it's going to be less than a week, including shipping. Whereas if you wanted to transfer 250 terabytes over the wire, depending on the speed and utilization, can take quite a long amount of time over the course of days, weeks, or even months. I mean, look at that 150 meg for 150 meg, for example, right? So that's well over a year. So that's where Snowball is really nice. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but we've got different size devices for different use cases or different needs. We've got the Snow Cone, which is up to 24 terabytes usable. It's about the size of a tissue box. Snowball Edge, our storage optimized Snowball Edge, like I said, about the size of a desktop PC. And then we've got our Snowmobile, where if you've got exabytes you want to transfer to us, that's basically that's a snow device that is going to be delivered to you in a tractor trailer. So that requires a lot of planning. That's not something you can just order from the AWS console if you ever had to go the Snowmobile route. So I know we're kind of getting a time here. I want to talk about how customers are using S3, right? So we talked a little bit about what S3 is, and there's a lot of different components to S3. It's a very broad service. So when I was putting this presentation together, it was tough for me to kind of think about some of the things. If I was a new Restart graduate, what would I care about, right, with S3? There's just so many different things. So apologies if I'm kind of going all over the place here, but because it's such a broad service, there's a lot of different use cases and there are a lot of different ways to use S3. I think it'd be helpful to kind of understand how customers are using S3 today. So I talked a little bit about backup and restore, right? So backup and restore, so I'm a storage partner solutions architect. I work with storage partners. So I work with partners like Veeam, Commvault, a lot of these storage partners that provide backup and restore and to be able to back up on-prem. So I cover Veeam, for example, right? They're one of the partners I cover. And there are a lot of Veeam customers who don't want to have to continue buying on-premises storage or keep buying tapes to back up. They want to be able to get their backups off-site in someplace safe, secure, and durable. And that's a really great way to start using S3, especially now with Object Lock. We've got, say, Veeam customers using S3 with Object Lock to really help them get a better better posture and better protection against ransomware, right? So they can recover quicker and protect their businesses better from ransomware. So backup and restore, really easy way to start using S3. It's durable. They know that their objects are stored in at least 3 places, as long as they're not using one zone. Also, archive and compliance, so media workflows, tape replacement, right? So maybe a customer doesn't want to put everything in S3, right? They only want annual their yearly backups to sit in Glacier Deep Archive, for example, for 7 years, 15 years, infinite number of years. That's really where S3 is going to be helpful for them, because they can use things like Tape Gateway to really help them with those archive and compliance. We also talked about things like home directories. Not so much. Not so much with, say, S3 compared to some of our more popular file offerings like EFS or FSX for Windows. But for customers who want to be able to use this, that's where something like a file gateway with S3 would be helpful. But it's not really intended to be a direct replacement to S3, only really for some of those use cases where you want to be able to use that storage in native file format in S3 itself, right? So it's good for some of those hybrid scenarios where you might start migrating some of your, not just your data, but your applications to AWS, and you want to have a consistent place for them to kind of sit, both using a file interface and object storage interface. That's where I see that. And then data lakes, we're going to talk about data lakes in a little bit. And then business critical applications. So it's amazing to see how much native integration has come in the past few years with S3, right? It used to be, there's a lot of off-the-shelf applications now that support talking to S3 and then they're business critical applications. So you don't need to worry about things like using a file gateway. So we look a little bit more into this. We talked about backup, archive, and restore solutions, data lakes. So if we think about data lakes, right, basically you've got all these different services and applications placing their data into S3. And the way to think about it with the lake analogy is S3 is the water for the data lake, right? And everything else is just kind of consuming, right? Either you're adding water in, or you're taking water out, right? Through things like some of these analytics services like Redshift, Athena, machine learning like SageMaker. That's really where we see customers getting, as they start going further along the cloud adoption curve. That's where we see a lot of usage with S3 as they want to build their data lake and get into some of these deeper analytics pieces here. So I know we're kind of at time, and if there's any questions, feel free to throw them in chat, and I will do my best to answer them. Going once, going twice. I promise guys I don't bite. Feel free to ask anything.
Hi, this is Tim. So get your, this is your opportunity to ask Anthony some questions about a very deep dive into S3, much more than we cover in the Restart program. It's terrific information. I've been listening the whole time, and believe me, I learned a lot too. So if you have any questions beyond the webinar, you can always email it using our postgraduate alias that we have in the actual graduate system itself. Anthony, thank you very much. If you have any last words for the students, that would be great. I really appreciate your time and your expertise, and what I think was really a fabulous presentation.
Thanks so much, Tim. The only last words I'll say is just having done this for a while now, and having learned this having learned AWS on my own, learning hands-on. There's nothing better than just getting hands-on with a service. No better way to learn. Get hands-on, use your AWS accounts, and get as deep as you can, because it's one thing to talk about it. It's another thing to kick the tires. That's the only way to really get truly deep with some of these services. So.
One last thing that I might add, and maybe you can help reinforce it or shoot it down, is I'm always harping on my students. Everybody wants their certification. Everybody wants to get a solutions architect. Everybody wants to become a developer. Yes. Everybody wants to become sysops. And I'm always sort of telling them to tap the brakes and practice. There's a reason we have an experience requirement for those advanced certifications. It's one thing to take a test and pass your solutions architect, I would say. It's another thing to walk into an employer and say, I have these skills, and the employer puts you in an environment where you have to demonstrate the skills. It's one thing to have the knowledge, it's another thing to have the skills. So like Anthony says, get into it and practice, practice, practice.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, I couldn't agree more, Tim. I know we're out of time, but I'll give you a quick story real quick. So like I said, most of my experience is infrastructure and operations. I pivoted my role from being an on-prem engineer administrator to being a cloud solutions architect. And the first thing I did was I got my solutions architect associate certification many years ago. And I thought that would kind of like open up the job offers and everything like that. And I started applying the jobs, and I didn't have the relevant experience, and I heard nothing back. It wasn't until I actually had practical experience and could actually tell them how things worked that I actually started getting nibbles, and ultimately was able to pivot not only within my organization at the time, but get hired by AWS as well. So I couldn't agree with you more, man. Definitely want to. You don't want to be. You don't want to have a paper cert, as we say. Use the certification. Use this certification as a guide and have it validate your existing experience and knowledge. Not so much experience, but knowledge about the products and the overview of the exam. But it should be more of a journey and not a destination, if that helps.
Absolutely. Let your skills reflect your certification, not your certification reflect your skills.
Couldn't agree more, sir.
Anyway, well, thank you very much, Anthony. I think that's it for today. For anyone in attendance, a recording will be posted in a graduate training class probably within the hour. Anthony, thank you for your time. Thank you for everyone for attending, and we'll see you next time, which I think is tomorrow.
Yeah, look forward to it. We're going to talk about certifications, security, one of my favorite things. So good stuff.
Very good. Thanks, everybody.
All right.
Yep. All right.
Thank you, guys. Bye now.